Hello everyone, today a reflection on communal Italy and the development of sharecropping. And yeah, I know it's the usual video about social and economical history, which is boring and all. And believe me, I'm not an expert on these things, as it's probably evident by the way, but I still think they're interesting. At least I try to make them interesting because I think there is essentially one big reason. That is, the more I'm making videos in general in here, and the more I even statistically observe how the general reaction is towards them. Besides my poor recording means and my boring voice and all. I realized that there is a certain approach to history in general that personally I have even difficulties to define in this fashion because I realized that most of the people who get interested in my videos at least doesn't like them very much when they begin to talk about, I don't know, great socio-economical aspects of, in this case of the Middle Ages, because that's really the only time of history that I cover from a general point of view, aside from military history, etc. And I realized that this happens, I don't know, for the same reason maybe I find economical history, let's say, I can say boring, but let's say it's not the first one of my interests. I even began to study economy at one point before studying history, and I kind of fled from there. But aside from this, I've always perhaps been interested in kind of the material world, and not really from in terms of material culture, but in the sense of historical materialism, without any ideological or dogmatical approach whatsoever. On the contrary, at this very moment in my life, I'm really discovering idealism in some measure, and I'm very interested to see how it's indeed the mind of some people that brought certain changes into history, not just the so-called structure that pushed towards certain direction. But in general, I think that this lack of interest towards socio-economical history actually stems from the um, I don't like to use the word ignorance, but I think in the neutral sense of the word, actually, that is. I think we are all ignorant by definition as humans. But I think ignorance towards history as history proper is what eventually leads to this, because people tend to think that history is like a story that someone tells, and that about weird things that happened in the past. How many times it happened to me to come across on the internet, I don't know, a promising video, at least historical video judging from the title, and then you get listening to the video, it's just the fictionalized style telling of certain historical episodes taken from completely out of their own context and told like a weird story. Usually, I don't know, for for gossip reasons, in a certain sense. I mean, all these strange figures that have been even caricaturized in the past for the sake of saying, look at how history was weird. You know, there is this kind of attitude really out there that the history is not the proper research for understanding the past from an objective point of view, from a wide comprehensive point of view, but just the the sheer minutiae, if you want, of history that taken by themselves are barely significant as such. And when you get to social history, you understand is that there is so much more to say, and that's why I perhaps got fascinated by even the socio-economical approach and historical materialism when I began to study history. I think that's actually natural, because when you begin to study history, you don't know much, and when you sense that there are these great structural dynamics, you tend to say, oh yeah, that's the history evolved because of that reason. Then eventually you develop a more complex picture of the whole thing because of human actions that evidently made the difference and all. But let's say that you immediately understand that you cannot tell history without knowing such things, and especially relative to military history. That is something incredibly complicated, but you cannot understand military history, especially if you do not know, aside from the strictly military matter, two things: politics and society. That's the Clausewitzian triad that you cannot escape from if you want to understand something meaningful about military history. I tell about military history because, as probably some of you already know, I'm making essentially half videos on YouTube about general medieval history, and the other half about military history from various times. So my aim is to make the audience a bit more aware and sensitized about military history proper, because I think it's greatly overlooked and especially greatly misunderstood. And one of the reasons it's misunderstood is exactly this: that aside from the military events, there can be the story of a battle, which is often what is only remembered in history, relatively to military affairs. You cannot understand war if you don't understand politics and society, and that's something you have necessarily to do, passing also through topics like these. So the consequence of this is that otherwise war gets even here fictionalized, spectacularized, and it's all concentrating around the usual 3 or 4 battles that particular national historiography has wanted to make the whole thing revolve, but without actually understanding even the story, the context of those wars and those battles. And that's why when I talk about military history, I generally talk about things that are more structural than else. I think I've discussed in almost 200 videos, like only 2 battles proper, and when I talk about military history, I discussed chiefly political and social factors that are really the most important one to understand that. And relatively to sharecropping here in communal Italy, I think here maybe I won't touch the thing, but it's very important to understand these developments of the Italian countryside, to understand also the Italian history of the time. That is extremely important for European history. Say we are a cross between the 13th and 14th centuries, so a moment of great change, of great development. And part of this is all about really these forms of land exploitation, which is pretty obvious because we are in pre-industrial times, and if you want to understand the society of pre-industrial times, you have necessarily to understand how these people organize their agricultural production, because there is no other way basically to understand phenomena like feudalism, or as the communal phenomenon like in here, or any other type of society, pre-industrial society, if you do not understand how the land was subdivided in property and worked and all. So passing to the topic proper, as I was saying, this in below medieval Italy, in communal Italy, um, there is a moment of great change into the countryside that is happening actually at many levels and for many reasons, of which the development of sharecropping is just say one of the consequences, of the many consequences actually, and part also of the causes, as always happens. So, and the development of sharecropping is has to be understood in the frame or in the context of the collapse of the great estates. Italy had this story of it was a Carolingian kingdom. It had seen, in this sense, an early rise of feudalism compared to other areas of Europe. But at the same time, it was very different because next to the land estates, it had a urban world. Also for certain environmental reasons that happened both for well, it's difficult to explain, but it were chiefly political and social reasons. The Italian feudalism was always a little bit more contained than, say, the French one. That is not to say that it was different in substance, because even Italy had its own very feudal world, but it started from different premises, even from different social bases. And especially the Italian estates were smaller, say, than the French ones. Even eventually than the German ones, even if Germany came later to be a fully feudal world. And the key, obviously, to explain this is the rise of the presence of cities, of a very thick and robust net of active urban centers that, in this sense, were competing, even economically speaking, with the feudal estates. I've discussed, actually, if you go into my medieval society playlist, I discuss actually how the rise of the cities, not just in Italy, by the way, but in the whole Europe, during the Low Middle Ages was something extremely intertwined with the same rise of feudalism in some measure. So the whole phenomena do not have to necessarily have interpreted in a positive, fashion. But it's pretty obvious that it was an intrinsic enmity between the urban world and the one of the rural lords, in a certain measure. This was mostly a social problem because essentially the Italian communes had been born through the urbanization of the same feudal lords that, especially up to the 12th and 13th century, were essentially the sole ruling class of the Italian communes, and that basically managed the whole political, military affairs, and gave, by the way, great impulse to the development of agriculture and the same trade activities that made Italy what eventually became. And this is obvious because Italy was not France or Germany. It was evidently opened to much more open to trade, especially sea traffics. So this the Italian economy is not surprisingly the one that starts earlier and has the after, say, the early Middle Ages, and it spreads let's say farther and wider than all the other European countries, and this couldn't pass but through the cities, and in this sense through the elite. And the problem, though, is that the economical rise of Italy at this point brings to an unprecedented development in medieval Europe of the commoners' classes. And these commoners were obviously very different, both in political aims and in culture, broadly meant to their from their feudal from the feudal class, essentially. There were some intersections because nobility in Italy, and this is interesting, was sensual. That is basically that you could rise to knighthood through essentially having a certain wealth. But generally speaking, not everybody could, and the largest part of the commoners were feeling themselves as this popular class. Even when they rose to knighthood, sometimes they stuck to the urban world as sort of popular knighthood, opposed to the feudal, the one of the feudal elite. But on the long run, and now this is complicated, maybe I will explain it or in other videos as well. Maybe I talk about that on the I've said something more pertinent in the, I think it's in medieval Italy playlist, and it should be the consuls in the communal world. I think, yeah, consuls in the communal world, and I discussed that because the consular class was essentially the one of the elite, or the feudal elite, because they elected the consuls who were usually, at least initially, from this feudal class. So I discussed these things if you're interested to understand more. But what is important now for today's topic is to state that to make clear that basically the popular classes at a certain point, especially during the 13th century, take over into the communes, and they manage either to subdue, in a certain sense, the feudal nobility, or to maybe at least in certain cases even to expel it from the cities. Then the change was never so drastic, telling the truth, because this feudal elite was too deeply intertwined with the urban political affairs to be, I mean, sent out. In fact, the people failed eventually into this, and the rise of the Italian signories is nothing but basically the coming back of this ancient feudal nobility. Excuse me, I drink a little. So one of the major consequences of this the rise of the popular classes within the communal institutions is that the so-called popolo, that is the Italian name used to define the people, that is these commoners essentially, was to try to not just to diminish the power of the militia, because this was actually the feudal elite's names, because the militia was in this sense deriving from the term miles, that identified the knights, so not the militia as we made it today. There's a bunch of commoners usually themselves. Even the commoners had a militia on their own, but they were mostly infantry. The feudal class had always been instead obviously the knightly class of that could produce heavy the heavy cavalry, like the one and like it was present in any other place of feudal Europe, essentially. But the populace begins to expand also into the countryside, and this was a natural direction of expansion because of the agricultural nature of a medieval economy. That is, if you control, especially in a place like Italy, where you have all these cities of ancient Roman foundation with therefore a very strong infrastructural base, and that have each one a city district on their own. That was originally speaking the ancient diocese, but eventually the commune expands. In fact, the popular classes at a certain point were even fighting against the bishops that were usually, in spite of what was happening in the clash of investitures, were really siding at a certain from a certain point onwards towards the imperial side, because the commoners' classes were usually pro-papal and pro-wealth in this sense, and even though the bishops were say theoretically men of the Pope, in practice were parts of that feudal elite that sometimes were also more deeply intertwined with the siding with the imperial power that could grant, that was more eager to grant benefits to this feudal hierarchy rather to the commoners that were seen even in ideological terms as inferiors. I mean, what the commoner classes managed to achieve in Italy was considered unbelievable in places like Germany. Let's just read Otto von Freisingen, what he's writing about the Italians, and especially in that context when Frederick Barbarossa was essentially trying to curb this the Lombard League. I mean, it was really a whole different world and an incredible one. And it's not surprising that I don't know that the Renaissance was born in Italy, not somewhere else. But because these communities were so wealthy and so even demographically strong that they could really oppose their force literally in open field against the major feudal powers of the time. So if they weren't if they weren't scared to face the emperor in a pitched battle, you can imagine what their attitude was towards the local nobles, with whom, as we've said, they had more ties, so they weren't so cruel against them as they could have been against these Transalpine lords, whose language they didn't understand and that were coming practically out of nowhere from their own perspective. So what happens is that the communes that the popular classes at this point had been monopolized in their institutions by the popular classes began to try to stem, at least to reduce the power of these magnates, because that was the term into which they were usually named. The magnate essentially identified a person that was richer than a certain standard that was set in the city. It wasn't that egalitarian in the sense that maybe that there were certain legislations that the people did ad hoc to target. I mean, I don't know, that specific lineage of feudal origin, because I don't know, in that moment it was particularly powerful and they wanted to kick them out from the city. But the important thing is that the commune expands into the countryside. And in the case of the most powerful communes, take Milan for instance, the power of the commune even starts extending over other cities. But this is another chapter that maybe we'll discuss another time. But if you're interested, I made quite a substantial time ago, telling the truth, something about the expansion of Milan in the 12th century that I think is interesting because it tells a little bit how that was taking place. Yeah, it's called Milanese expansion during the 12th century, but here I'm seeing that there is also a very important video I made about this topic that maybe helps you to understand a little bit better how what were essentially the legal and political and legal tools that the Popolo was using to expand into the countryside. But not just the Popolo here, it's just about the commune. And the title is Between Dioceses and Comitatus, the Expansion of Italian Communes. It kind of tells it a little bit, but I will surely come back on these topics with more dedicated videos, because they are of terrible importance. Like what was happening there in terms of civilization is something that fairly that far surpasses basically even what the more unitary national monarchies was going on. I mean, Italy was chaotic, a bit like, this is the general stereotype that exists about Italy, but that happened because it had a huge kinetic energy. And therefore it's a really messy situation that and maybe another video that makes you understand how eventually that turned out is the one about the lordships. I mean, I think it was the origins of the Italian regional states, and there is also about the first Italian lordships. I've discussed fairly enough about this, and these are all. I mean, these are not chapters you can really, mm, let's say, reduce to a single video because they're extremely complicated, more even more than just complex. They're really complicated. Um, so the obvious direction, as we were saying, to for the Popolo to expand was to seize the agricultural goods of the so-called contado, that was the city district. And essentially the popular classes in general weren't warlike. As a matter of fact, they had built their own identity in a positive terms compared to the permanent warfare that the feudal elite basically imposed to them to go fighting against other cities and all. So even if they had that, in order to curb that, they had developed in turn their own military institutions. They kind of wanted just to stop there, to essentially to be left alone, and to mind their own economical business, because that's what they were already about. Initially, these were classes of craftsmen with a certain degree of egalitarianism, even from a political point of view. Eventually, when they seized power, they began to grow corrupt, and to essentially the majority of commoners starts getting poorer at the expenses of the richer commoners that become bankers and all are extremely wealthy. And basically there is a sort of short-sightedness of these popular classes, because they objectively couldn't handle political and military affairs, especially in the international, say in the Italian political and military context of the time, that instead was fastly accelerating towards an escalation of warfare, of internal conflicts, for which these popular governments were genetically not predisposed. So eventually they ended up, that's why the seigneuries basically rose at a certain point. But so once again, as we've said, the expansion took place on the estates originally belonging to the military aristocracy, and also to the ecclesiastical aristocracy. They were essentially the same thing, because they were both bishops and knights came from the very same families. And there was the initial construction of essentially small and middle-sized agricultural companies that belonged to either to the rural families, because it wasn't there were certain commoners that lived actually outside the city, even from a political point of view. There were certain rural communities, even certain rural communes, because even the commune is not something really institutionalized in the feudal districtuation of Europe at this point. The commune is more like a corporation from a juridical point of view. So you could find even on the same city district that obviously revolved around the commune of the main city, a lot of smaller communes, even of rural origin, so that maybe they were just villages or other smaller burgs, or say smaller centers of sorts that existed in there. But the creation of these new agricultural companies actually was chiefly in the hands of the citizen owners. This means that they weren't really these owners weren't really the ones who worked that land. It was of their property, but they lived in the city. They were middle class. They had other business, and naturally they were renting. They were yeah, they were renting that to other people, to peasants that lived outside the city district. There is also in here a there are many interesting studies, even from of historical geography, that shows you actually the development of these properties around the cities, the main highways of the time. They're very interesting because even the city, in this sense, was split up in a certain sense. You know that the communals, the medieval cities usually were split into quarters, or say quarters when it was split in four, but there are other terms like sextiers, if sixtiers or some, I don't know. I don't know whether in English the word does exist, or even, and these were essentially certain parts of the city that ideally but also practically extended into the countryside, meaning that from that side of the city where that quarter existed, let's say going outside the walls, you had a quarter of the contado that essentially was occupied by the properties of the people who lived in that quarter. So there was, in this sense, a even sort of factionalism between the same popolo, by the way, because the popolo wasn't so unitary at one point. Actually, the crisis I was talking to you about before comes from the fact that also from this point of view there were different interests. I mean, if, I don't know, there was a war that wiped out a half of the district with throughout devastations and all, it's obvious that the guys who had who had properties in that side of the countryside would have got poorer and less capable even of participating to the political activity of the city. So the other quarters might have benefited from that and increased their power on them. And you know, this is and maybe be say growing interaction with certain nobles, with certain magnates, and so it's really this complicated. And and the interesting thing of this is, in fact, that every city has its own history that is also strictly related to the nature of its own territory. I personally, a bit like Kant, I like to look at this ancient medieval maps and to go look all the various tiny stories of these political entities, because I like what the Middle Ages is, and from this point of view. That's why I like the Holy Roman Empire so much, because between Italy and Germany, it's extremely fascinating to look at all these small entities that all have their own story and interaction and all. A lot of warfare going on, by the way, so it's also fascinating from that point of view. The Another factor that could play into this was the time of into which the urbanization had happened, because actually these communes in the 13th century were rising so fast, even from a demographical point of view. I made also in here a video about the demographical expansion of Italian commutes. If you're interested, you can go check that out. You see that especially in the 13th century, the Italian cities rise at an incredible rate. And that didn't happen because there was, because those guys were copulating like rabbits. It was happening like in all the great demographical growths in a certain place in pre-industrial times. Basically, were immigrants coming in. And the same commune, in this sense, had been created a little bit like that. Even the ancient contrast between the militia, the magnates, and the commoners, excuse me, and say between the feudal elite and the rural lords, say better, of feudal origin, and in the urban world had increased because there were many serfs or peasants that had fled from the feudal from their feudal commitments to take refuge into the city and become a citizen, and therefore to in a positive sense, in a positive direction, respect with respect to the feudal the feudal institution in some measure. So this process actually was it took some time because there were, I mean, the Italian cities were populated um, very strongly, say, since the early medieval times. Actually, there is no real discontinuity between Roman times and the Low Middle Ages, and aside from a very few and minor centers. But let's say that cities in Italy have always remained alive, unlike other parts of Europe. So there were obviously certain citizens that were of more ancient urbanization that obviously loathed these newcomers. There are situations, if you study, for instance, the history of Perugia in Umbria, you realize that in there the commune at a certain point is taken over literally by the immigrants. Obviously, it's much different from I don't want to really draw a parallelism between what the immigrants are for us today and what they were at the time, because that world was much more fluid by standard. But I'd say that there were contrasts even within the same urban classes, and the citizenship especially was something extremely prized, and citizens were jealous of their own prerogatives. And usually, in fact, even most of the people who during the 13th and 14th century came to live in there or to around were immigrants that in this sense were maybe working in the city in the day and then went living in the suburbs out of the city walls at night. And then this is also moments to which urbanistically speaking the Italian cities expand, so that maybe the old city ring the old wall ring was insufficient because the suburbs had grown too important for the urban economy, and they had to be protected as well. So maybe there was a second or even a third or fourth city wall that was built to encompass all of that. So you can imagine all the implications that came from here. I think that these cities at this time had really money to throw away. If you wonder, I don't know, like such big cathedrals were built at the time, or was such huge walls. Those were investments that were financed, let's say, as non as a sort of an amount in grants, because it wasn't even important there to spend those money, but it was about all the people that were coming to work in the city and to consume, to pay taxes, and that's how Florence has been built. All the magnificent monuments you can see in there. Well, they really started from these things. Then eventually, during the 14th century, there is the big economic crack of Eurasia, we can say, and that is stemmed a little bit, so that in fact most European cathedrals are usually being finished during the I don't know, the 18th or the 19th centuries, because that immense wealth that was being experienced in these centuries before the Black Death actually had brought to such such enterprises. So when you think of the huge investments of this time, you have to think that most of them were actually made into the by the citizens into the countryside. So the idea was to create to make of the city district a sort of big, large agricultural company. And this involved obviously the building of roads, of bridges especially, and to hold fairs and controlling, even militarily speaking, so getting rid of brigands, building watchtowers, fortresses, checking the major passage points and exacting tolls, because that was also you have to think that around the Italian roads was literally shifted the wall a transcontinental trade. So think of all the money that they were doing just through that, and you have to think also that in the medieval world, as much as the ancient world, the taxation was actually pretty low compared to our standards today. So these investments are all only a very tiny part of the world wealth that existed beneath, in some measure. So the major reasons why these investments were made, obviously there were great businessmen as always that were shifting very big capitals and all, but at least up to a certain point where there was a functioning middle class, a functional middle class in these cities, the main need was to invest in the countryside, was to provide essentially the alimentary resources for your own family. That's it. And this was done chiefly because the annuary market was rather still floating in some measure, because there were great, as we've seen, there were great international trades, but sometimes there were also lots of wars. So it could happen that, I mean, the city couldn't really rely just on grain imports. This began to happen chiefly when, in times of great of famine, so that there was literally no food for enough food for everyone. So that especially the cities that had best access to the sea, they usually made them imported from somewhere like Sicily, usually, or Apulia in Italy. So they couldn't really rely on that. This is probably fine also elsewhere into Europe. There were certain cities that were increasingly specializing in certain cultures. Like if you take Bourgogne, for instance, there is a famous. I don't remember which author it was, but basically was saying that these guys weren't cultivating wheat. They weren't producing wheat anymore because it was enough to export their wine to basically buy any other necessary good. So in Italy, that's an exaggeration. Obviously, no community at that time ever lived in that fashion, but it kind of gives you the idea that and that was by the second half of the 13th century. That gives you an idea of the impression that this extreme economical growth of the low Middle Ages had, what effect, what impression made on the contemporaries, because up to that time, agriculture had, economy had been essentially a survival one. And this kind of wealth was considered incredible in many ways. And then, as we were saying, another big factor was, however, still the famines that could. There was this incumbent threat at the time, proving, in fact, that this community was still relying on the local agricultural resources at that point of entering in crisis in moments of famine. There were stocks, there were warehouses. I mean, if you read the chronicles of these cities, you realize that it was kind of normal. You had to put that into consideration. It was a loss every once in a while. of resources because of bad weather, either too hot, either too cold, or I don't know, and were hailstorms or maybe floods as well. Think about all these great cities into Lombardy or into Tuscany that were flooded sometimes by the Po and Arno rivers, these big rivers that actually triggered their own the same city's prosperity in some same measure. So it was a world that functioned substantially like that. Another factor for that would push you to invest um, into agricultural property, into rural properties, was the relative difficulty of really investing somewhere else. I mean, there were these great investments also in companies, in banking, and all, but that usually happened only for the very, very wealthy people, and mm, however, the risk inherent to such activities was seen, and agricultural resources were still there in some measure. I mean, that was really how the whole economy was based on. Even banking was de facto based on that, because the whole even trade economy was based on the surplus deriving from agriculture. So in terms of costs benefits, it was definitely maybe a more sound investment to buy a piece of land and just dealing with that. And that it's a bit difficult to make you understand with my poor English what it means. Like, but for instance, there were certain contracts that really tells you um, how economy after all was still extremely slower compared to our one, which which is pretty obvious. But for instance, one very well, we see a transformation also in here. There were many contracts, originally speaking, in emphyteusis. The emphyteusis was basically a contract that allowed you to rent a piece of land, a certain property, to, I don't know, a family of peasants, say, and you say, I don't know, for 99 years. It's a very long time. Think also that people lived less at the time, so it was a lot of generations. For 99 years, you can work that land. And then after those 99 years, I'm going to take back my land because it's still my property. And this was very common at the time. It was actually a very ancient form of contract, especially in the region around Rome. That was pretty much the standard. In that case, it happened because there was only one great landowner in there, which is the greatest landowner that can exist in medieval Rome. It was obviously the church. And in that case, essentially the land belonged to the church, nominally at least. Basically, people began to build, the Romans began to build around there. I mean, farms, other, every property you can imagine. And that was automatically an emphyteutic contract because the church still owned all that land, so theoretically could claim back those properties at a certain point. Obviously, even in there were certain I mean, even the popes didn't have this huge contractual power because it's still the land belonged to the local Roman nobility that was in this involved into this factionalism between, I don't know, pro-pope and anti-pope factions, and also but juridically speaking, at least just to make you understand, it was something extremely common and that had started since a very early age. Yet, however, as we were saying, now economy is still fastening up a little. So there is a greater dynamism of agricultural production in part, and therefore there were certain short-term contracts as well that were being experimented, and that's where sharecropping enters into action. the sharecropping is something, especially in Tuscany, has been I don't know the milestone of local economy for up to I don't know the 20th century. There were entire regions that really were living with this forms of contract, and the sharecropping was born essentially in this period between the 13th and 14th century, and basically it entails that the property excuse me that the landowner basically gives some mm, some investment for I don't know, for instance, for seed, uh, working animals and working tools, or to maybe better, generally speaking, the structures that were present on his property, so that the peasant could live there. And the peasant basically paid with half of the every year with a half of his product, and with the satisfaction of other lesser duties, essentially. So it's not a few, right? Like half of that of your agricultural product is still very much. I mean, this in especially in Tuscany and Lombardy, some were some of the wealthiest lands of the world at this time. So, but still, for pre-industrial standards, because otherwise it was still a very miserable living condition for today's standards. But at the same time, it was considered advantageous compared to the rest of the options that exist in medieval Europe. And it definitely there was a lot of market revolving around these contracts. So these agrarian contracts, together with the political and institutional cohesion, let's say, of the urban centers, increased the dependency of the rustics on the citizen landowners, essentially. There is a term that enters into play, that is the laborator terre in Latin. That means essentially the land worker. That increases. Even you can see that into contracts, into I don't know, into literature and all. And it became eventually something that became to define a world in some measure. So that between the Middle Ages and the modern age, you have a citizen world, a urban world that basically controls this surrounding countryside, and in a obviously with an evident with an evident displacement of a disequilibrium of rights, even because these peasants were increasingly more tied to their service, to their duty, especially after the crisis of the 14th century. You realize that there is an increase in the subjection of peasants to the great urban elites. And it is part of that crystallization of European society that eventually gave birth properly to the modern Ancien Regime. Because the Ancien Regime, yeah, it's being born very very early in time, ideally, but let's say that up to the 14th, 15th century, the medieval society had been, European society had been relatively fluid. Even peasants, I discussed about this in medieval society playlist. Now I can't remember the titles I made, but there is the one of the idea that basically the peasantry lost this big battle that, I mean, the peasants lost their place at the thresholds of the modern age into the institutions of the Ancien Regime. And they ended up to be subservient essentially to the ruling classes, either of the feudal elites or the urban ones. So that's how it really happened. And and sharecropping became to really characterize the Lombard and Tuscan countryside, even in terms of landscape, because you have to think of all these productions that entail a certain exploitation of the land, of geographical expansion, of you have to think that at this point the Europeans begin even to invest much more abroad. So Europe is rising in many ways, and this entails that the Europeans have managed to accumulate lots of wealth that eventually is redistributed even physically on the soil in terms of investments for I don't know, the reclamation or canalizations and all this stuff that eventually transformed the countryside, even physically speaking. And the idea is also that obviously the contracts were always harsher in a way. So the peasants at a certain point didn't know where else to go, and obviously the landowners exploited the situation to impose on them increasingly tougher contracts, in especially for increasing production. Telling the truth, sharecropping in this sense was a much more competitive thing than the great latifundia and then instead characterized other areas of Italy, like I don't know, the papal domains of Lazio or southern Italy as well. So sharecropping was instrumental also to build up things like the Renaissance. The Renaissance, how was it built? It was built also on the sweat and tears of lots of people who were breaking their back all the day on the land, who did pay the the salaries for the humanists to spend their lives into libraries and to study and write. That's it. It's always been so. I mean, I don't want to make it a sort of classist criticism about this. It's just that this is the reality of the world, and we can appreciate civilization, but never forget that it came out of the efforts of many people who eventually couldn't even benefit of it. So. We have to bear it in mind. Most of the people, by the way, back then were doing that. So basically, I don't know if you want to take it personal, but I think we all have ancestors that passed through to those things. So that is had to be borne in mind. So and this telling the truth, just to stick to put a stick on the wound, and fresh wound, really. It was accompanied by a sort of cultural mockery of the peasants. The idea that the peasants were sort of half animals or stuff. The rustics the rustics were idiotic, and they had this is something actually that dates back to a very long time before. I mean, even if you take the Germanic elites of the ancient world, I mean, the idea was that just slaves worked the land. The true freemen had to fight, and this was enforced into by chivalric ideals. I mean, in the chivalric literature, the peasants is really it's a worthless individual, barely a human being. It's like half beast. You have to think that at this time, I mean, today we know we know biology, we know, I don't know, psychology, sociology, etc. But those times the world was also subject to these such arbitrary interpretations. There was a lot of ignorance and prejudice, and people looked at the world. I mean, I still think that those people were more intelligent than what we are today, and I don't think there is nothing to be surprised about it. Simply, it's bare intelligence. It's like, it's not intelligence necessarily for good or bad. It's simply skill. But culturally speaking, you see these conceptions that are hideous, and that correspond to actually the lack of rights that today we have, and that at that time were justified in part. And I wouldn't like I'm not a moral relativist, so I don't want to justify this, but you have to think also that by those times it wasn't even normal that the world was in this fashion. I mean, the same peasants, even though they wished that they could rebel and do something about it, and they actually did in some occasions, but they were still, however, thinking that, I mean, that was just to free themselves from these terrible, these dire conditions they lived on, but they weren't thinking anything like that they were equal to, I don't know, to nobles. I mean, it was a very theoretical thinking. The society was meant to be hierarchical, and that was the common belief that existed, and that had always existed. And that sadly was kept being enforced by these inequalities. So I know satire toward the villains is really a sop for into legal forums, into literature. There are so many examples about that, and and what is important, I think, in conclusion about this is that there were, however, certain steps through which this happened. I mean, one might have this plain picture of the Middle Ages, like, I don't know, the peasants were always exploited. Actually, things are much more variegated. It had not really been so. And today talked about communal Italy essentially because that's the place where you can see the faster changes occurring, right? So you have, compared to the relative homogeneity of European economy at the time and society, in Italy you have that extra extra dynamism that in this sense makes allows historically to observe more let's say faster dynamics, and it makes you understand. In this case, what I want to say is that this new form of land exploitation actually derived from the changes that were occurring into the communal world, into the urban world. So it's obvious that this was still happening because of the countryside being a certain fashion, so it was all intertwined. But the general picture is that if there hadn't been urban classes, but let's say feudal classes, things would have gone in a different way. Sharecropping would have not existed. Probably there would have been a sort of larger estate with very different land exploitation, etc. So it's important to look at this because these are things that eventually marked the history of entire peoples, entire populations around Europe for centuries, for a very long time. Yeah, I might conclude with a brighter perspective on this that wasn't definitely happening most of the cases, but let's say that serfs could be freed in some measures. So it still could happen that a little social mobility could take place. Even the Ancien regime, in this sense, is not this completely crystallized world. There were still changes that occurred. I sometimes make kind of reason in terms of extremes to make you better understand the difference. But once again, you have to study every single reality to eventually understand what the situation really was. So for now, I thank you very much for listening to me. I hope you enjoyed my this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested about my upcoming videos. And for now, I thank you very much. Once again, I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.